Hello everyone, my name is Shashwat DC from Azim Premji University, and on behalf of the university, I would like to welcome you all to a special edition of Nature in Our Cities series. This is part of the broader Seeking Sustainability initiative of the university. So basically this has been a webinar series where we have been talking to experts on different aspects of species that cohabit our landscape, our houses, our neighborhoods. So as part of this thing, we have with us Suhel Quader, who's a scientist with the Nature Conservation Foundation. And we'll be talking about the State of Indian Birds report, which has come out very recently. And, examining the various aspects of the report, what is the status of birds, how are they doing, what are the threatened species, and so on. So, let's look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much, Suhel, for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
To start off the conversation, the first one, the big story that we have is, the State of Indian Birds report that has come out very recently, the 2023 version. So if we were to start with on the birding aspect, and which you are quite, famous for as well, what would you say are the salient features of the report?
So the report, there are multiple interesting things about the report, if I can say so. One is that a lot of it, majority of it, is based on contributions and observations made by birdwatchers and enthusiasts. So in that sense, it's a very large collaboration with 30,000 people who've been part of this and generously shared their observations on public platform. The second is collaborative in a different way because there are 13 institutions that came together to take this information and put it together in a coherent sense for the report. So some 50 people from 13 institutions were involved with putting the report together, which, as I say, analyzes and summarizes this database that I've mentioned, but also does a few additional things beyond that as well. So in multiple senses, it's a sort of a collective effort. So that's number one. Number two is that it assesses a large fraction of the bird diversity in India. So there are in all there are 1,350 bird species that have been recorded in India, but about 1,200 are species that are regularly found in India. And out of those 1,200, this report assesses 942. So it's a large majority of our Indian birds, and what tries to do is to understand what is their status, what is their conservation status, how are they doing, how are they faring, what is the health of their populations. And it does that by using, partly the data I talked about to look at their trends in abundance, how have they been changing over the years, for the last 25 years. And it also looks at how widely they're distributed. So based on these two things, it puts birds into three different categories of conservation priority. So there are 178 kinds of birds that are put into highest conservation priority for India because of a combination of either their populations are declining over time or they have a small range distribution or both. And then the others are put into moderate priority and into low priority. And from this then and some additional analysis are derived some lessons. What are the species we need to focus on, what are the habitats we need to focus on, what are the threats that we need to be investigating more closely. So the report tries to synthesize all this into one document.
Okay. So if we were to just talk about the importance of this report and relevance of it in Indian landscape, how would you say that, while there's a lot of, birding as an activity and ornithology for that matter as a subject has been pretty popular in India, but has there been an attempt then, say, vis-a-vis, say, other countries and all who have worked on this thing, collating a data on such extent?
Well, I think that so far a lot of work has happened. If we take conservation, it's been focused on threatened species that are already very few in number, and there are a few like that, the vultures, bustards. There are a few species where there is attention, both nationally and at state levels and locally, because they're on the verge of extinction. What there has been less attention to in the Indian context is species that on the face of it seem to be doing fine because they're abundant, they're widespread, but they may be changing, without us noticing. And in other countries which have had these kind of monitoring programs and these assessments in the past, they've seen that, a large fraction of their bird species have been declining without, without people really noticing. And we were curious to see if this is, similar over here. And in fact, we do find that there are species that are still common, but there are clear signs of very severe decline over, 10, 20 years. And so one of the additional kind of lessons from this report is that we shouldn't be complacent about species that we still see around us. This morning we went for a walk, we saw black-winged kite. Black-winged kite is one of the species that's declining. It's a bird of prey. And we feel that conservation of biodiversity isn't just about saving those rare and threatened species from extinction. It's about keeping the species that are common and abundant, keeping them common and abundant. And there's a pragmatic reason for that, which is that we think birds and biodiversity in general, they provide important services for humans, important things for humans. For example, some birds are thought to help in controlling pests in crop fields, right? But they can only control pests in crop fields if they're abundant, if there are many drongos or many insectivorous birds. Once those birds start to decline, they're not going to help farmers in that way. So we need to keep those common species common. And one first step is to have a very a regular monitoring system to see how they are doing. And if they are showing those signs of decline, we need to have actions that will follow and responses that will kick in. So that's one of the things that, we, in addition to saving threatened species from extinction, conservation is also about keeping those abundant species common. And this report is one mechanism to provide early warning signals if that's not happening.
Okay. There are two things I'll come to. The first one is saving threatened species, as you said.
Yeah.
In comparison to say mammals or land animals, a Project Tiger it has worked wonderfully well. How do you save these threatened species, especially birds? What can be the challenges in those clearing spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. In many cases, we don't know the answer. So with a species like tiger, it's been studied a lot. We understand it, and we know like for any species, it needs space, it needs things to eat, and it needs safety. So tigers need habitat, which is forests typically, although tigers are also found in non-forest habitats. It needs its prey, sambar and cheetal and so on. And it needs to be kept safe from things like hunting, poaching. So if those three conditions apply, tigers will do fine. At a broad level, this applies to any organism, any species. But sometimes we don't quite know exactly what is the problem. When vultures started to decline in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, it took 10, nearly 12 years or something to diagnose why they were declining. So there was habitat. They still had the same habitat. There was food because we still saw, people saw carcasses around, but they were dying for some reason. So what was that factor? So it took research, quite hard, difficult research because it was first thought to be disease and various disease things were investigated, didn't turn out to be disease and so on and so forth. We see this for birds of prey. I mentioned black-winged kite, but there are eagles and so on that are declining, but we don't know why. On the face of it, maybe the habitat seems to be okay, but we are not very sure. On the face of, we don't actually know about their food, and we also don't know about potential toxins in their food. Maybe their mice are eating insecticides, it's accumulating in their bodies, the raptors are eating those mice and then they're being affected by it. We don't know. So one of the frustrating things about this report is that we can see those declines happening in the data, but in most cases we don't know why they're happening. So one of the clear calls that the report makes is that we need focused attention on these species and these groups of species. For example, as a group, insect-eating birds are declining. So we need focused attention on these groups of species, research attention, so that we can try and diagnose. So that involves, catching these birds, checking their tissues, looking at levels of pesticides, doing surveys of insects, seeing how abundant insects are and so on. It's painstaking work, but it needs to follow up. The report is only the start.
Yeah, but just one, because you spoke about the vultures and how the diclofenac issue that was diagnosed finally,
yes.
But despite the ban on use of diclofenac and despite the report is very, bleak on the future of vultures, how do you correlate that thing that even though action has been taken, it has not, really...
Yeah. Well, I can't say this with some evidence, but I feel certain as I can be, that if there hadn't been a ban on diclofenac, probably there wouldn't be any vultures left today. So the ban has helped probably helped slow the decline of vultures, but the decline has not stopped. Because of various reasons, it could be, and there's some evidence that diclofenac is still in the system, that even though the ban is on veterinary diclofenac, not human formulation of diclofenac, some vets are still used to diclofenac, so they prescribe, they get the human form, the human vial diclofenac, and then, give it to cattle. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that as vultures have declined, people have stopped throwing their carcasses out and they bury the carcasses. So earlier it didn't used to be a food problem, but now it's quite likely that food supplies actually have gone down. So some combination of these things and maybe a couple of other things, too many dogs, feral dogs, competition with dogs, perhaps that is continuing the decline. I don't work specifically on this, so I can't say more than that. But it shows that we can't be complacent just because, on paper, veterinary diclofenac has been banned.
Wonderful. Also, coming to the other thing that you spoke about, the common species. So if we take about our urban landscape,
Yes.
there are a lot of, we talk about the common species like sparrows that have been declining over the past many years, and even some states have made them. Delhi and all have, you have a sparrow day now. But on the other hand, you have species like the pigeons, which are, kind of exploding in numbers.
Yes.
So how do you, kind of make, comparison between the two? And
Yeah. Well, of course, as humans modify the landscape, there will be, crudely speaking, winners and losers. The losers are those whose habitat and requirements are taken away by urbanization and agriculture and so on. And the winners, those that thrive, will be those that are able to survive and manage very well in these modified landscapes. Urban landscapes, suburban, parks, gardens, things like that. I mean, since you mentioned sparrow, I should say the State of India's birds report shows that sparrows show very little decline. Sparrows are doing fairly well. They may have disappeared or declined in some cities, but there are other cities where actually there are lots of sparrows. So it's not purely urban and non-urban phenomenon. And in most villages in the country, there are sparrows everywhere. So the newspaper headlines that say, sparrows on the verge of extinction, this is not true. They're not going anywhere. They're not by any means on the verge of extinction. There are many other species that are much more deserving and worthy of our concern and attention than sparrows are. So sparrows are kind of middling. But the species that are actually increasing are those that are benefiting from these changes. The pigeon is one of them. And of course, pigeons benefit because they naturally in the wild nest on cliffs. And what do we have in cities? We have artificial cliffs. We have apartment buildings that exactly mimic them, and they've got nice ledges also for the pigeons to nest, as everybody knows. And we feed them in addition. People feed tons of grain over the country, to them. So we are subsidizing them. We're actually encouraging. Obviously, they would breed. Pigeons are actually fascinating birds, but they're known as rats of the skies because people don't like them. But in their own right, they're fascinating. But another winner in that sense, just to point out, is our national bird, the peacock. And the Indian peafowl has, I think the report says it's increased by more than 150% in the last 20 years, 25 years. And it's gone into places where it was not found before. And in places where it was found before, it's increased in numbers there as well. And that's because the peacock, A, it is strictly protected under law, being our national bird. And B, is actually, if it's not hunted, if it's not persecuted, it's very adaptable. So you will find peafowl, I don't know if you know this, in the center of Ahmedabad city at night, roosting on top of a billboard that's brightly lit. You'll have a set of peafowl, just in the middle of the city where there's not much greenery around. And you'll see them in farms and you'll see them in orchards and so on. In fact, they've increased to such an extent that they're a real problem now for farmers. And in places where they didn't used to be, now there are peacocks there and they're eating all the, new shoots and so on. So increases, just like with pigeons, you might think it's obvious pigeon increase is not necessarily a good thing. But oddly enough, increase in our national bird, the one that we take a lot of pride in, even that can cause problems. So conservation, there's another dimension, which is not just preventing these species, some species from reducing, but what to do with the problems that arise when species become too abundant, super abundant. And if we don't manage that conflict that may arise, then we can lose all social support for conservation. So it's something to think carefully about.
Wonderful. Also, if you were to talk about the report, coming back to the report itself, how many observations were there and how many citizens were involved in the whole?
Yeah. So the people, there are about 30,000 bird watchers and enthusiasts who As they go about their hobby, which is bird watching, they also upload these observations onto a public platform. This platform that we use is called Ebird. And I say public because the public can use it to contribute, but the public can also use it to take those observations out. So the entire database is available for research and education and conservation. So the set of data that was used for this report, which was updated as of, I think, June of this year, was about 30 million observations made over a span of time. And some people, in fact, went back to old-time bird watchers, or went back to their notebooks and digitized their old notes and uploaded that as well. And that's actually allowed this kind of time travel, where we're able to look at not just what happened over the last 10 years, which is when this platform has been available, but what has happened over the last 25 years, because people have gone back and uploaded their historical observations. So you do a bit of time travel through the notebooks and the digitized observations of bird watchers, and are able to see, well, how frequently did people report peafowl in the 90s compared to how frequently do they report them today, averaged across the country. So that's the general method.
So which was the oldest kind of a record that you kind of used in how back in the time you traveled?
The oldest record available in the data set is from 1969, I think. That is the oldest record by a living person.
Yeah.
So what some enthusiastic people have done is they've gone to published reports in journals and so on, and have digitized those as well. And those might be from authors who are not with us anymore, obviously. But a living, breathing birdwatcher, the oldest report is from 1969, from Himachal Pradesh, I believe. So it does span quite a bit of time.
So this huge data sets that you're collating,
Yes.
examining, how long does this whole process take? We're just curious.
Oh, it's not for the faint of heart. There are two aspects, broadly speaking, to this. One is nowadays, of course, everything is helped by and facilitated by technology. In this case, a combination of online technology and portable technology, your smartphone. So the technology is one aspect of it, and then there's the social aspect. So there's the human aspect. How do we build the technology to make it most usable and friendly to humans? But there's also things unrelated to that. For example, how does one spread the word? How does one get people on board and tell them about this amazing technology? And how does one even talk to people about, well, what's the value of this? That the 10, 15 birds I saw today in my garden, if it's not private to you, in your heart only, but it exists actually in a database, it can be of so much more value. So that is a communication problem, which is a bit different from the technology problem. So in India, what we have done is, because we use a global platform, which is Ebird, they are the ones who developed the technology, but we are the ones here on the ground in the country and in different states and so on. And through, we work with so many birdwatchers and birdwatching groups, and deal with the more social and communication sides of it.
So of the, you said of the 1350 birds, 942 were chosen for this particular report. And any reason why, certain species were left out? Or?
The species, we had some criteria to choose species. For example, with the report couldn't analyze species that are extremely rare, or where there are not many observations. So there's some threshold criteria, and those species that couldn't meet the criteria, mostly because of lack of information, those had to be left out. The previous report, which was published 3 years ago, that assessed 867 species. And this difference between 867 3 years ago and 942 this year, that increase, is because of the additional information that became available. And so down the line, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, whenever the next report comes out, hopefully we can cross the 1,000 species barrier, because there'll be enough information for those additional species that we can keep adding until we're able to cover nearly the total number.
Yeah, and it's very interesting when I was seeing that map, lights of observations,
Yes.
that the whole Indian map
Yes.
lighting up. You also see a lot of observation happening in very disparate places, even in open seas for that matter.
Yeah, well, so the open seas, of course, is one where we've got some islands, so Lakshadweep and Andamans, of course, those light up, and there are bird watchers there. And then there are ornithologists, but mostly like professional ornithologists, but mostly actually birdwatching enthusiasts who go on these trips. They call pelagic trips. No? Pelagic refers to the open sea. So they will hire a boat and they'll get together a group of 20 people and, pay for it. And then go out up to the continental shelf or so on and go at, 10, 20 kilometers and make a route and come back and look for birds that are found in the open sea. These are birds that are very, very rarely found or visible from land. Only when there's a cyclone or a storm, some of them get blown in. Otherwise, they're only found out there. So until birdwatchers started doing this, maybe 15 years ago, we really had very little information about what are the birds of Indian territorial waters, but out in the open sea. And so, therefore, in the map, you'll see those points of light where, which are the lists and the observations uploaded from those geolocations out in the sea. And then, of course, there are other parts of India where there may not be so many. For example, the deserts of Rajasthan, there are not many local birdwatchers who are from there, but there are many visitors who go to places like Desert National Park and other places over there. But increasingly we're seeing it used to be until a few years ago that in most of Northeast India, apart from Assam, almost all the birdwatching there was being done by visiting birders. Coming there for birdwatching and then going back. But increasingly now, there are people who are from there, who live there all year round, they're residents of that place, who have been birdwatching before perhaps, or have taken up birdwatching. And that's really the heartwarming and the important thing, is that people who are from those places are documenting the birds of their own landscape, their own region, and better through that, gaining a better understanding for themselves and their districts and their states of their avifauna. Very different from somebody coming from far away, visiting just for a week or two and then going.
Wonderful. If you can just give us a little bit of light on that map itself, the way it lights up. How do you assess the density? And there are some areas which are, Kerala for that matter is very brightly lit in that comparison. So on what basis is this thing? And what does this map tell you about the overall, bird watching thing in India?
So the map and the points of light, the points are just the locations of an individual list of birds. And they basically reflect where people are birdwatching. And where people are birdwatching depends on two things. It depends on the number of birders who live there, or it depends on how many birders come there for birding. So we'll tend to find places with a large number of resident birders, brightly lit, like Kerala is very brightly lit, because Kerala has a long history of birdwatching and literature in Malayalam on birds and so on. There are many birdwatchers there, very enthusiastic birdwatchers, have been doing lots of work over the years. And so we find a lot of birdwatching and a lot of contributions to the database from Kerala. There are some other places where maybe, as I said, the northeast and some parts of Sikkim perhaps, so there aren't that many resident birdwatchers, but lots of people go there, visit there. And sometimes they visit there specifically for birding. So we'll tend to find a lot there. So if neither of these conditions is met, neither are they resident birdwatchers, nor is it a popular place for people to go, those are the places where we'll find, the gaps and the less light. And one of our interests now is to see whether we can challenge birdwatchers and say that, on your own, you may not choose to go to this dark spot, where there isn't much birding. But how about taking up the challenge and going and seeing what is there and, contributing that information so that we have a more comprehensive understanding across the country, not just these bright spots, but also in the darker spots. So how can we fill those gaps? And some birders also take this up as a challenge. They say that, it used to be my goal was to see as many birds as possible. It used to be my goal to go to a lake or location where I can see lots of birds. Now my goal has changed. Now I want to help to fill the gaps in understanding, help fill the gaps in knowledge. And those bird watchers are amazing, very motivated, and they're really the future, I think, for filling that gap in knowledge.
Wonderful. There's one interesting question which Monica, who is a faculty at Azim Prem University, she's an avid expert on bird.
Yes.
She said this question, while going through the list of priority species in Karnataka, surprised to find the thick-billed flower pecker. We hear about the pale-billed flower pecker frequently in and around the campus. Why is the species similar in resource requirement declining in our state?
So that's an interesting question. The priority species for states, if I remember correctly, and I may be misremembering, is based more on the the fraction of their distribution that the state accounts for. So if the bird is found in a certain area, how much fraction of that area falls within this state. And I can't remember the trend for thick-billed flowerpecker. I don't remember whether it's declining or not. But it is certainly an uncommon bird compared to the pale-billed flowerpecker, which I think she refers to, which is commonly found all around here. So that's the rationale. I don't know specifically about this species, and I'm unable to say more about that.
Yeah. We have been talking about the use of technology for that matter, mobile phones and everything.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about the usage of it and say things like Myna app?
Technology, as you know, is a mixed blessing, but in this particular case, it's been instrumental to this boom in birdwatching and documenting birdwatching, in a way that can be used for purposes like the state of India's birds. If you are out in the field and you're birdwatching, right now with the app, the Ebird app, you can, as and when you see the bird, you can enter its name, you can put the count, how many you've seen and so on. You can add your notes and then you can upload that list. When you come back, you can from your desktop also upload media files, audio, video or sound recordings to accompany that, and that provides an entire different dimension of richness to the database, because that's also publicly available, and researchers and educationists and conservationists can use that, the images and the audio and video and so on for their work. So that's in terms of, the input ability that technology provides, but also provides a tremendous ability to take this massive database and kind of provide it back to the audience, whoever is interested, in usable form. And something that the State of India's Birds partnership has done is to create an online feature we call Myna. Myna stands for Mapping Your Neighborhood Avifauna. So Myna is one of our common birds around. We realized that the reason this was developed is we realized that a lot of people would ask, what are the birds I find here in this region? And the earlier tools that were available were not customizable. So you could say what's found in this spot, what's found in that spot, but not what's found in this region. And so what Myna does is it allows you to go to this map. You can draw a polygon, click on the map and say generate a report. You can choose a year range and generate a report, and then it'll give you a whole bunch of information about what birds have been reported from that user-defined area, including what is their conservation status. Globally, the IUCN categorizations, what's their conservation status in India, which is the State of India's Birds categorizations, which of those are endemic, that is restricted to India and not found anywhere else, which of those are migratory and move back and forth, and so on. And so we anticipate that this will be an important tool for example, those conducting those who just want to understand, what's in my region. I want to create a poster or information sheet about the birds available, so that's now available at your fingertips. As you might know, whenever there's a developmental project, there's an environmental impact assessment, and the agencies that conduct those impact assessments need to go and survey for different aspects of biodiversity. And they still need to go and survey. This doesn't take away that need, but they have this additional set of information they can use. This is my region affected by this project, so there's a nice downloadable report that they can take that summarizes beyond what they can do in the field. Normally you spend a week or two in the summer, let's say, and you miss out all the winter migrants.
Absolutely.
So now this is available, and so on. So we think there can be multiple uses of this tool to different kinds of audiences.
And if you can throw some light also on the kind of how do you authenticate the data and all the observations? How is that done in the back and how it's ensured?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because the information that goes in is meant for use, for serious uses like, assessing conservation priority and so on, and would not be fit for that use unless there was some fairly rigorous data quality process happening. And so in the platform Ebird that we use, there's a combination of an automated and a manual data quality process. So what happens whenever you contribute a list of species, based on the location, your lat long, and based on the season, your list gets passed through what's called a filter.
Okay.
And the filter defines what species you might expect to see in this location in this season. And if you see something outside that, Or if you report more numbers outside that, you might expect to see one black-winged kite, but if I report 10 black-winged kites, that's really unusual. So then that gets caught by the filter and gets put aside for review. And the rest of the observations go in the public database, but these get set aside for manual review. And what will happen is one of maybe about 200 reviewers, editors and reviewers in India, all of whom are local experts and volunteers. One of those people will look at this record and examine, is there any other evidence, is there a photo, is there some description? And if there isn't any such thing, they'll correspond with the birdwatcher and say, this is really unusual, it's a very interesting report. And you happen to have some notes or a photo or something. And then once they get that additional information, then they will mark it as for public view. So as I say, there's a filter, which is the automated part, and then there's the manual thing. And this is part of also the social part of this. That technology can't work entirely on its own. Technology, at least this technology, has to be mediated and moderated by human beings, human experts who can carry out correspondence, who can make judgments about this, and so on. So it's a really interesting setup that way.
Okay. And what do you make about these labels that are there? The IUCN list that is,
yes,
the red list and the color codes that are there. And the state of SOIB also has these kind of, we have defined categories.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of contention, in terms of, what should be, do we have sufficient data? So
yeah.
How do you make of that, what do you make of those arguments?
In general, in life, it seems to be a bit unwieldy not to categorize. So we have 942 species, and we can, or rank them in some way. But in order to communicate to others and also in our own minds, it's useful to categorize with some understanding of the limitations of that. Now, in some cases, of course, there isn't enough information. In which case, we would, with birds, that's less and less the case. With other aspects of biodiversity, with many frogs, for example, even IUCN Red List says there's not enough information. They have a category called data deficient,
yes,
which just explicitly says this data, we don't know what's happening. And data deficient species, in fact, those there, we need an extra effort to go out and find out what's happening on the ground. With birds, the number of data deficient species globally is fairly small compared to other groups of biodiversity, other species. And the ones in India are also small, although, as I said, there are a number of species we just don't categorize, are not in this 942 because there's not enough information. So that's made explicit. So the red, the high, moderate and low priority is for those species where we are able to make an assessment and all the rest we're unable to make an assessment. The worrying thing is that if you look at the comparison in the 2020 report and 2023 report, most of the species that we're able to analyze now, but earlier were data deficient, many of them come into the high priority list. So data deficiency might actually be a symptom that actually these species need help.
Okay.
They are not equally separated into low, medium and high. They tend to disproportionately be in the high once we get the information.
Yeah, if you're not seeing them, most probably...
It's a bit of a worry, yes.
Yeah. So just, what is your expectation a report of this kind would, play in conservation awareness?
I mean, awareness is one. The report at the end, the last chapter, has some very specific calls to action, which are divided into different sort of kinds of things. So one is, we need conservation attention on particular species, like birds that eat insects. They're declining. We need to understand why they're declining. Birds that are, birds of prey. We understand why vultures are declining. We don't understand why the other birds of prey are declining. And there isn't enough information on this. So that's on species. We also, say that there are some habitats that seem to be particularly suffer. So birds of open, grasslands and scrublands, what we call now open natural ecosystems, they're under threat. And it's quite likely they're under threat because their habitat is under threat. Because open natural ecosystems, typically in Indian parlance, we categorize them as wastelands. So they're free for all, people plant trees and so on, where they aren't naturally trees. So obviously species that are specializing on these habitats don't have less and less space. That's not the only habitat. There are coastal mud flats. There are rivers where there's not enough conservation attention, and the birds of these places are declining. So there are habitat-based calls to action. The third thing is that there are many research gaps. Like we don't know, there are data deficient species. We don't know why some of these groups of birds are declining. So there's a call specifically for researchers and scientists to say, please come and you must investigate these things, because otherwise we know they're declining, but we won't know why. And without knowing why, we don't know what to do about it. So that's the third bucket of calls to action. And the final one is about law and policy, which is laws and policies to do with conservation should be enabling. And we suggest some ways in which they can better enable conservation, especially because conservation in India largely so far has been about place-based conservation. So I declare a national park or a sanctuary, and we have a network of such national parks and sanctuaries, but they cover only 5% of India's land surface, and they will never cover more because India is a big country with lots of people. They won't cover more. But if we have the second goal of conservation, which is to keep abundant species abundant, we can't restrict our conservation attention only to this 5%. Conservation should be something that happens in the landscape as a whole.
True.
So whether it's about worrying about pesticides and insecticides, whether it's worrying about revenue land that's being, grassland that's used to be used as pasture by local people, now is converted to plantation. All of these fall outside the ambit of the traditional conservation areas. And so law and policy there is really important to recognize this. So for example, our wasteland development policy has to explicitly recognize that these wastelands are often legitimate natural ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
And when we develop these wasteland, so-called wasteland policies, we have to be sensitive to that. Or the river policy, or the river interlinking, or all these kinds of things. We can't just say here's a conservation policy.
True.
And all the other policies are whatever they are, right? We have to, if we want conservation to happen in the larger landscape, then there should be elements of this sensitivity to conservation in all our national policies.
Linkages
and linkages, they can't exist. So that's one of the calls to action in terms of law and policy.
Wonderful. And wonderful, before I end this conversation, this edition specifically, we have been talking of birds and...
Yes.
So we, what are some of the species that you kind of like, some, unique species or some anecdotes that you can share? And most importantly, also a sub-question to it would be, what are the species you did a birding walk today with the students. Which are the species we can find around our campus in Bangalore?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that although, of course, urbanization kind of decreases the number of species and the specialist species, still on the outskirts of cities, sometimes in the middle of cities, if there's some habitat, you can see a lot of birds. If I'm to speak about Bangalore in particular, Bangalore is kind of unique in that there are more than 100 spots, like lakes and campuses and so on in Bangalore, where you can see more than 100 species of birds. So no matter where you are in a city like Bangalore, at least, somewhere relatively close, there'll be a place, not your apartment complex, but somewhere close by there'll be a place where you can see a large amount of bird diversity. So we should take advantage of this and, go. Birdwatching has lots of benefits for us to, calm ourselves and relieve our stress and mental health benefits. So that's number one. This campus is, of course, outside, really on the outskirts. So there's lots of open areas. There's lots of birds that otherwise you wouldn't see in the city. The birds I particularly like aren't very exotic or rare. One bird that we saw, in fact, this morning, was the Indian roller. Neelkant, it's called, and it's a favorite bird in many states. It's a state bird of many states, 4 or 5 states perhaps, Karnataka included. And it's also called the farmer's friend. So they're an insectivorous bird. They tend to sit on lines and so on, poles on fields, and they eat a lot of insects. But they are declining. The State of India's birds has found. And so it was very nice to see 2 of these birds this morning. They're a fairly drab brown bird. About the size of a crow, but when they fly, suddenly their wings flash brilliant blue. Okay. So it's like suddenly there's a surprise. This blue flash, where you didn't suspect it to be. And then the other bird favorite I have is one I've done research on, so it's my favorite, is a Baya weaver.
Okay.
And we saw this morning, nests, but they were old nests, so we didn't see the birds themselves. And Baya weaver, like Indian roller or Neelkant, I think is known to many, many people. Anybody who lives in a vaguely agricultural rural landscape will know these birds because they're very loud. They build their nests in colonies on trees, usually above a well or a pond. And in the breeding season, which is the monsoon, there are these bright yellow males, all busy flapping and displaying to females. It's also one of my favorites, partly because it's unusual among birds, where the male is the one that builds a nest, and the female doesn't do any nest building. Most birds, either the female builds a nest alone, or male and female together build a nest. But here in the weaver birds, only males build the nests. And they're loud and raucous and rowdy and fight with each other all the time and shout at each other all the time. They're a great bird. So these are some of the birds that we can see in a place like this.
Wonderful, wonderful. With that, I'd like to end our conversation today. I hope there are many birders. After seeing this, I'm sure there'll be in Bangalore. I see a lot of birders.
There are birders, yes, and in all big cities. Yeah.
Yes, so I hope this kind of prompts them into walking outside and
yes, hopefully
watching the birds. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shasha. Thanks a lot.